Well, just barely good afternoon. I'm Bill Gropp, the director of NCSA, for those of you who from outside of NCSA. And it's my pleasure to introduce Larry Smarr. Larry, of course, was the founding director of NCSA. His vision led to the creation of the NSF supercomputing centers, which have evolved over the last nearly 40 years into national computing resources upon which resources around the country depend. He's also a world leader in exploring the innovative use of computing, not just supercomputing, and I think we'll hear some about that. And he's the winner of way too many awards for me to list here because I want to get to Larry's talk. After founding and launching NCSA, he became the founding director of the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, or CAL-IT2. He's also well known for something I think quite unusual, but I think very fitting to someone who thinks outside the box. For his participation in a more than 2-decade-long study on his own body, the first of its kind. In fact, it was the subject of an article in the magazine The Atlantic called Larry Smarr, the man who saw inside himself. And I think that also says something about Larry's interest and determination in pushing the envelope and just thinking about things that most of us just don't get to. He's had a very long interest in building and supporting the scientific community. After all, that's where NCSA and the supercomputing centers originated from. He mentioned in his abstract for his talk, the Alliance and iWire, things which I had the pleasure and the honor of participating in. And I'm really looking forward to his discussion and talk on the National Research Platform. And with that, I'll get out of the way and turn it over to Larry.
Thanks very much. Well, it's great to be back. Good to see all of you. Some of you were here in the moments that I'll discuss at the beginning of NCSA. I will spend most of the talk on describing the National Research Platform, which is the largest sort of distributed compute and storage platform in the United States right now for academics. But as I was thinking about coming back here, it occurred to me that so many of the features of the National Research Platform originated in innovations that occurred at NCSA. And how many of you were here in 1986? Okay, so for the majority of you in the audience, this will actually be sort of an interesting history that you weren't there for, but has had huge impact to the future. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to give the distant past on all this, but before there were NSF supercomputer centers, those of us who were researchers, and I was in general relativity and astrophysics, had to sort of wander around looking for supercomputers and ended up in Germany using the Max Planck Institute and so forth. And I realized that there were other people like me whose research had been blocked, basically. They knew how to do their work scientifically, but they didn't have access to advanced computing. And so I wrote this supercomputer famine in American universities white paper in '82. That got turned into the famous Black proposal that was an unsolicited proposal to the NSF that did not have a program in high-performance computing, and it certainly helped stimulate that. And so here we are by '85 in the beginning of the construction of what became then the supercomputer in '85 and '86. And what was interesting is that Sid Caron, I had been at Livermore. I had to get a top secret nuclear weapons clearance and then lived between the cracks at Livermore to be able to do my black hole collision work and other astrophysics work. And so, of course, I assumed that's what a supercomputer was and the center was. And so in the Black proposal, essentially cloned what Lawrence Livermore's system was, but for an open environment as opposed to a classified environment. I did not know Sid Caron, and he did not know me. And so a year later, he put in an unsolicited proposal because he had come from plasma physics and the magnetic fusion energy network. And then those two proposals were among the 5 that were funded. But the key thing I want you to keep in your mind for a little bit later in the talk is that was 40 years ago. It was a huge step forward for the country because the National Science Foundation worked with the Department of Energy and adopted what they had spent years prototyping and then brought it to the whole academic research community. That will come back to the next time they did it, which I'll get to later. But I want you to remember that although we had a supercomputer, that red thing there, the IBM PC had come out in the early 80s. The Mac, remember the Super Bowl commercial, was 84. And here we are in, 85, 86. So it was just a couple of years after the personal computer had come out. And so, of course, we said, well, gee, the personal computer is real easy to use. The Cray is really hard to use. Why don't I use the PC and let the PC or the Mac use the Cray? And somebody said, well, won't we need some software for that? I said, yeah, there's this thing called Telnet, and so we adopted that into one of the first of the NCSA software packages, NCSA Telnet, which was used by probably 2/3 of the people who logged on at that day onto the net. And so this is a distributed computer. You have to kind of look down here, but you see this little diagonal thing? That's a wire on the floor that's connecting those two computers and Ethernet cable. And so NCSA was in the distributed computing, multiple computers tied together by network from day one. And it is sometimes lost that in history that is the case. The next networked set of supercomputers were when the NSF-NET was created. And although it seems sort of comical to look back on this as the big pipe across the country was 56 kilobits a second, but at the time, that was 50 times faster than using a dial-up 1200 baud modem. So it was a super network, relatively speaking, and we continue to exponentiate that way. Now, we're going to go from, in this talk, less than an hour talk, from 56 kilobits to 1 to 400 gigabits per second. And so, I don't know, every minute of my talk, the network is getting faster by tens of thousands of times or something like that. Anyway. We had this crazy idea that we couldn't wait for fiber optics to appear. And Donna Cox, who was very active in SIGGRAPH, had the idea of putting together at SIGGRAPH 89 in Boston what she would have called a simulacra of what the future is going to be, which is we were going to use satellite dishes, analog satellite transmissions, to emulate the future when we'd have in-the-ground fiber optics. And this is actually on YouTube. I really recommend it. It's held up well. Then they put a giant AT&T satellite dish outside the parking lot of CAB, the computing building where NCSA was housed in those days, and then one outside the Museum of Science in Boston. And then we could do literally interactive from the first Sun 1 workstation that had a video card in it. We could actually control the Cray at NCSA to run an application, and their between me and Donna is Bob Haber, who is a professor here in engineering, and they were doing a crack simulation. And this was actually real time. Now, it was a 56-baud modem behind the curtains that was dialing back to NCSA, and then there was the satellite link and everything else. But we were able to show what it was going to be like when you could eliminate distance between computers and people. And we even went to the White House. This went to the Congress. This is Al when he was still a senator. He'd just become a senator. And got him to record an introductory video. And he was just very clear. This is the way it's going to be when we have high-speed fiber optics. So NCSA, before, I mean, it's like one thing when all of the hardware is in place, but to predict it and to show it in a much more difficult way, I thought was sort of amazing. Now, here we are with Donna and Bob, who's here, doing these fantastic visualizations. This was one of the early ones that is data-based. This was from data on the traffic over the backbone. This is 1,000 times higher bandwidth, now 45 megabits a second from 56 kilobits in just less than a decade. So this exponential growth of the network is what is going to enable, in the end, the NRP. Now, how many of you worked or knew about the gigabit test beds? So this is a program that Bob Kahn and Bent Cerf, who was the partner with Bob, Bent and I were having an email exchange between 4 and 6 a.m. this morning, because we're still friends and working together on things. And what they had is, we had these first fiber optics that could do a gigabit per second. And so they had several of these test beds, and they said, well, okay, let's hook up computers, right, at the ends. And the interesting result in the final report on this, which was a DARPA test bed, was the fiber worked just fine. It could move photons at 1 billion bits a second, but when it got to the computers weren't capable of accepting that speed, because of course they weren't set up for that. And that was the bottleneck. Now remember this. This is what we call the gigabit test bed bottleneck. And until you break that, you can't really make use of the underlying speed of the fiber. Now, we continued to work, and often with groups like Argonne, for instance, Rick Stevens, EVL, Tom DeFani, Maxine Brown, and so forth. And so when we had Supercomputing 95, where Sid actually was the chair and I was the program chair, we put together for the first time the first 155 megabit research network by interconnecting the commercial networks. They had never been interconnected before. And we were, now think of this, we're using IP over ATM on the commercial networks, and we put out a call for proposals, and we not only hooked all the supercomputer centers together and all the virtual reality centers, and this was all into the San Diego Convention Center. Of course, I'm still here, not knowing that 5 years later I would move to San Diego. And we needed a software system to organize it, and that's the key thing. Even at this sort of tinker toy putting together for the first time a national network like this, we needed an overarching software system. And so, that's where basically Ian Foster and Carl Kesselman and so forth developed the ISOF programming environment to run iWay, and from that came Globus. So that then, was where Globus was invented and then later commercialized. Because of our collaboration with EVL, we were able to have the second cave in the world, I think, after EVL at UIC. And of course, we had industrial partners using it, and Caterpillar's use of it drove a lot of what was done there. And here is Caterpillar making a real-time global link between NCSA here, Peoria, where the proving grounds are, Houston, and Germany, and they're bringing up a full three-dimensional version from the CAD/CAM drawings of this thing, and then deciding, okay, where should we put the fuel camp so that's easiest to use? And so all these folks at different development and manufacturing and everything were working together on this virtual world. For those who think Zoom was invented just recently. And then, of course, NSF went from the 5 supercomputer centers to the 2, NCSA and SDSC, to lead the 2 PACI programs, Partnerships for Advanced Cyber Infrastructure, the NCSA Alliance and the NPACI led by San Diego. Now, if you look at this map, it's going to look just like the National Research Platform. Notice that you have, in this case, the VBNS, which gets up to 2.5 gigabits a second on some of the links. You have the little glasses are virtual reality, which you now call GPUs. So they were run by Onyxes, which were essentially the same SIMD architecture. And you have data caches, which SDSC in particular had around the country. That's exactly what we have today in the National Research Platform. But this was set up, and we talked about it, to prototype the 21st century information infrastructure, and it was a prototype because, of course, a few years later, NSF, like normal, decided, okay, we had enough of that, let's move on. But building this, and then what's most importantly, the community of all of the participants, figuring out how to go from what's inside a building to all across the country, all these different organizations, universities, national labs, everything, industrial partners. How do you organize a community like that? What's in it for each of those people to be involved? That is at the core of what we have today in the community supporting the National Research Platform. So this really was a prototype. And in a very deep way. And of course, the VBNS, it was when this was, the NSF finished funding the VBNS, that's what started Internet 2. So this directly led to what is today the major national network connecting all the universities. And Miron Livni, I remember in the director's office, which at that time was, NCSA's director's office was in the Beckman, 5th floor of the Beckman Institute. We had a sort of a thing like this on the wall, and Miron was sitting on the sofa in my office saying, you know, this is a national technology grid. You may notice that there's a similarity between National Technology Grid and National Research Platform. The only difference is that it was a little bit later. Now, here's an example of what that PACI environment enabled. Donna and Bob again, you know, and Stuart Levy, is there somewhere? Okay. They put together what, I got to say, looking back on this, it's so futuristic. I almost get shivers when I get this slide. This is so far ahead of its time. And even today, we don't really have this environment. It's what Meta talks about creating, but hasn't. And this was real. And we were taking a digital representation of the Chesapeake Bay, working with researchers at Old Dominion University that worked right there on it, data-driven, brought up into these multiple different kinds of virtual reality environments, and you had your avatar, so it knew where you were in the 3 space, and then the avatar could talk to it was just stunning. And that really showed what could be done when you could have this kind of computing. Now, David Bader was one of the partners in New Mexico, and here in '99, just before I left, I flew down there to launch the Roadrunner, which was the first COTS, the first commercial off-the-shelf supercomputer. And it led to, and this is why David has been so honored and led to the IEEE Fernbeck Award, as many other honors that David has earned as a result of this. But this became the prototype of all future supercomputers, which are all based on now COTS and all the commercial clouds. But this was the first one. And this was hooked for the first time to the network in '99 as part of the National Technology Grid. So I love this quote from the article that Rick Stevens and Paul Woodward, one of our longstanding supercomputer users, Tom DeFonte and Charlie Catt, wrote. This was in 1997, saying, our goal is to make a powerful, persistent, distributed U.S. resource as usable in the future as the NSF supercomputer standalone machines were in the 80s and 90s. That was 25 years ago. And now we've done it. It takes a while sometimes. Now, I want to bring up another thing, not NCSA, but it came out of NCSA's work with Rick Stevens at Argonne, and Charlie Catlett, of course, was here and then is now at Argonne, Tom DeFonte, others. And that is, we had, along with Indiana, the first dark fiber optical networks of any two states in the country. And I mean, it's sort of funny to think back on this, because nowadays you always assume, well, California is going to be first, or if not them, Texas or Massachusetts. No, the Midwest. They did it first. And when I got to California, one of the first things I did is got on the California Research and Education Network, CENIC, and they were purchasing bandwidth from the commercial vendors. They did not have a dark fiber network. And I joined the board, the volunteer board for the CENIC, and I said, I just came on the wagon train from Illinois out here to the promised land of California, assuming I would be in the future when I got here instead of the remote past. What is that about? And a few others like me who are hotheads convinced CENIC that maybe they should get into the dark fiber business. They now have 8,000 fiber miles of CENIC owned and operated fiber supporting not only all the 3 private Stanford, Caltech, USC, the 10 UC campuses, the 23 Cal State campuses, 116 or so community colleges, the 9,000 K through 12s, and the 200 libraries in California with fiber optics. So given that, and then the fact that the QUILT, which is a set of regional optical networks, meaning that they sprung up all over the country and are still there today, which is the key organizing feature, that all came because of the innovation and the initiative shown in Illinois and Indiana in creating iWire and iLight. They were the models. Now, based on that, I'm going to switch now to what happened after I left here and went to UC San Diego. And I put together, again with collaborators, a number of them here, like Maxine Brown from EVL was the project manager of the Optiputer. And this was, you notice the IP in red in the middle? So it's the Internet Protocol over fiber optic connected computers. Now it's hard to imagine. You can see how what we built in a very short period brought the TeraGrid in for the supercomputers. 4K was just starting, and so we could bring in, here's like the Tornado in 4K from here at NCSA. The National Lambda Rail was that time the optical fiber across the country, hooking universities, and so then we could bring in these tiled walls and all this stuff. At that time, we still lived in an island universe where if you had, say, a cluster, like remember Beowulf clusters? Say you had gigabit Ethernet backplane, and then you were connected by more than gigabit, tens of gigabits optical fiber, people were convinced that you couldn't coherently use that as one single computer because I guess they sort of remembered, like when I was growing up and we would call on the telephone my grandmother in Mississippi from Missouri, and I'd be on it for 5 minutes and my father would start stamping his feet. He said, "Son, do you know how much that's costing me a minute at long distance?" And they had in their mind, it must be that way with fiber optics. Now, I was a physicist, and I knew light didn't have any problem in the fiber once it loves being in the glass. So I knew that it could all be coherent, but we had to show that, and that's what the optoputer did. And in doing so, it made a conceptual shift from the computer being the center to the optical network being really the center of a distributed system. And it showed that, in fact, the wide area network bandwidth could be just as fast as the local area network. And that created essentially a phase transition to completely coherent national scale, international scale distributed systems. Now, interesting, I love this quote from the director of the NSF in 2005 because he was concerned, even though we were getting this national distributed optical network, he says, the trouble is that the high-speed data lines crossing the nation are like 6-lane highways, but then when you get to the colleges and the universities, these massive conduits are reduced to 2-lane roads on our campuses. Does this remind you of the gigabit testbed problem? You could go just fine in between, but when you got to actually terminating it, okay, so what the DOE did, and now we come 30 years after the NSF and DOE worked together to create supercomputing centers, we had the second example of this, in which DOE, through its ESNet, one of the most advanced optical networks now in the world, developed a solution for what happens when you get, for instance, to the DOE national laboratories, where all their instruments and facilities are and everything. They had to come up with a way to get past the gigabit testbed bottleneck and what Director Bennett was saying is a 2-lane road situation. And they developed what we called, and they could have maybe come up with a better name for it, Science DMZ, because Vietnam was still fresh in our minds at those days. Anyway, what it did is they needed to have what they called a DTN, a data transfer node that would be able to terminate and take in at full speed the wide area network. They needed to be able to measure between these things, and so they came up with something called PerfSonar, which we, of course, adopted as well. And they would put this on the on their laboratories or then on the campuses and segregate the traffic from the researchers who had big data and that sort of thing from just the commodity internet that all the students and everybody were using. And this was in 2010. Well, NSF paid attention, in particular, Kevin Thompson, who's one of the great program officers in my experience. My first funded NSF grant was 1979, so that was, a while back. And he's been one of the best in that whole period that I knew. He set up a program called Campus Cyber Infrastructure, and they've made almost 400 grants on demand from campuses to put over $100 million into the campuses to build out these kind of DMZs on the campuses. Well, by 2015, I said, okay, when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I remember my father taking me to the edge of town to show me all these giant machines that were building what became the interstate highway system to interconnect the cities. And I said, well, gee, big cities have freeways, and they would say, when the interstate highway system is built, you can start in Los Angeles on a freeway and end up in New York City on a freeway and never see a stoplight. So you grow up in the 50s, you have all these weird ideas in your head, and I said, well, shouldn't that be the way it is now that we have on the campuses all these NSF-funded DMCs? And so I put together a team to build what became called the Pacific Research Platform. And I said, we'll just start with California because we've got scenic already there. It's interconnected with optical fiber, all the campuses. A lot of those campuses had already gotten NSF campus cyber infrastructure projects. So, in fact, in this diagram, the blue things are all examples where the campus had already gotten one of those. So we could just hook them up and create this uniform research platform. And then my co-PIs and myself, and notice that Frank Wertheim, who at that time was a physics professor, is a co-PI, and hopefully that was thinking ahead. So what we did then in the next few years is this team at UCSD put together what we call FIONAs, Flash I/O Network Appliances. What it is they are DTNs that we customized to specifically hook into optical fiber networks like scenic, and to be able to keep up with the data flow at 10, 40, or even 100 gigabits a second. And that was pretty radical. Of course, I did it just like I did a lot of things at NCSA. I built on the commodity industry's PCs because every year, several hundred million people buy those, and so on their nickel, everything gets faster and cheaper. And so that's why you ride the commodity curve. And so these are just rack-mounted PCs. They have multi-core, like these days, 48-core CPUs. And then you can put up to 8 gaming, 32-bit gaming GPUs in the back. And you can put terabytes of solid-state disk in the front ends where the network interface cards come in. So that's solid state. So it can handle the speeds and then intermediate, gradually impedance match that to the several hundred terabytes of rotating storage on the back end. That became the thing that made the Pacific Research Platform and then the National Research Platform possible. And then they're just rack mounted. And so they just go into existing machine rooms where you have some space, and then they're hooked up. Now I'm amused as I look at this to go back to 1988. Where was NCSA? They did the renewal proposal from the Black proposal, and in it they said, well, we want this shared memory multi-core machine, the Cray 2, and that's a MEMD machine, and we want a CM2 because it's a single instruction multiple data machine, and we had them in the same machine room. Well, if you go today inside either the FIONAs I just showed you or Blue Waters, you'll find there's a shared memory multi-core CPU hooked to the current instantiation of a SIMD architecture, which is the GPUs. And so literally from 1988 till today, the same architecture is what we're using, whether it's a supercomputer or this distributed system. Well, once we figured out, and Tom DeFani particularly gets a lot of credit for figuring out that if you use the 32-bit GPUs, you know, NVIDIA was shipping, I don't know, 50 million of those a year to gamers. So not only are they they're much more inexpensive than the 64-bit gold-plated ones, most of the data for machine learning is not double precision. So using a double precision GPU on data that isn't, it's kind of crazy. And in fact, research papers show that you could get by with 16-bit GPUs or even 8-bit, and that would work for most data. So the idea that we could get many more people involved by using the gaming PCs, the GPUs, led us to write a next proposal called CHASE-CI, Cognitive Hardware and Software Ecosystem Community Infrastructure. And believe it or not, the reason we got this is because the NSF wanted a community-owned and operated resource, not a standalone machine room supercomputer center. And so this meant that we went around to all these universities from, you know, Merced to Berkeley, Stanford, all of these, San Diego State, for instance, CSU, and interviewed the faculty who were doing what we now think of as AI and machine learning research. The proposal was just like we did for the Black proposal. We had in it a whole bunch of paragraphs of researchers who were blocked because all they could get is one GPU in their PC under their desk. And they needed a lot more. And so the NSF said, okay, here's 256 GPUs. You go scatter them around and get these folks up and going. And so now it's the computer science and engineering faculty, not the disciplinary faculty, that are the NSF is saying they're underserved from an infrastructure point of view. And so that's what made the whole thing take off. So it's the same thing as just, you know, it's quite a bit, 35 years later. Okay, well then, how did we actually get these out there? You know, Tom and I are 60s guys, so, you know, basically you get the VW minivan and you put the, you know, you put the Fionas in the back, and then you have a road trip and you go to the campuses, and then you, hey, hang out with the guys there, and hey, you got a machine, let's put it in, and okay. And so it was a very community-focused approach, and these are just pictures from all the different campuses we went to. But we didn't want to just have it restricted to California, and it wasn't just California. We reached up through the Pacific Wave to Washington State and to University of Washington and out to NCAR. But we wanted to move across the country, and so we put in another proposal toward the National Research Platform funded in 2018. And so in addition to CNIC and Hawaii, and then, as I say, NCAR, and then IMRIN, that Joanne Breddy and Tom Maxine were involved with in Chicago, those were the original core of the Pacific Research Platform. But this then funded us to reach across to Texas to learn and to TAC, for instance, as a supercomputer center, to the Great Plains Network, which is the whole Midwest, and then out to Kinber in Pennsylvania, and then with Internet 2 as a partner, linking together everything else. And so that gave us a national footprint. And then finally, just a couple of years ago, NSF funded, with Frank being the PI, Frank Wertheim, the prototype National Research Platform. So we got toward the National Research Platform, our prototype, and this set up 3 different groups, including a lot of more interesting FPGAs, programmable chips that you could have as well. And there's a big support group in University of Nebraska at Lincoln that's at the core for what both for this and what became the National Research Platform, and then as well as the East Coast Green HPC Center. Well, so all of this is then integrated together, and last February at the 4th National Research Platform Workshop, we declared this is now the National Research Platform. And so all of these 22 years of NSF grants are basically integrated into that. And I, of course, retired in June of 2020. So it was time for me to move on, and Frank had moved up from being co-PI to being PI of the prototype, and so he was the natural choice to run the National Research Platform, of course, as well as not only the San Diego Supercomputer Center, but he's the executive director of the Open Science Grid, which we'll come back to in a minute. Okay, so where are we today? Well, we call this whole system that's integrated together from all these distributed parts and the software layers that make it all work, Nautilus. It's a multi-institutional, think of it as a hyper-cluster. It's community-owned and operated. All the Fionas are on somebody's campus, somebody put them there, they take care of them, and then, as you'll see, that we take this metaphor a little bit further. So there's 200 of these now, Fionas across at least 27 campuses, but they're all optically connected. Now, if you think about what's in Amazon or Meta or Google, any of the clouds, they're just a bunch of PCs with multi-core CPUs and GPUs connected by optical fiber all over the world. So this is essentially an academic cloud architecturally, right? But we're up to now over 20,000 CPU cores and 1,300 GPUs in this distributed hypercluster called Nautilus. Now, what it means is the price of entry is that you have to containerize your application, or, as we'll see in a minute, use Jupyter notebooks that allow you to do all of this easily. So this is still a barrier to a lot of researchers that aren't familiar with containerization. But once you containerize it, then Kubernetes, which was developed by Google to orchestrate, if they're doing 1 billion searches a day, you can't have a human in the loop. So Google realized, okay, we got to containerize whenever you request a search or something, that's made into a container. Then we got to have a software orchestrator to spread those out across the world to all our data centers and execute on wherever there's available space and time, right? The beauty is they made that open source, and the other commercial clouds, instead of saying we'll do our own, adopted it. And so we adopted it, and now you have this reverse thing, which is the opposite of, say, like when Mosaic was developed here, and then it went out into the commercial world and changed the world. Here, it's the commercial world coming back to the universities, and that's changing the university world. It's a very interesting shift. And then Kubernetes takes your containerized you don't even, having grown up with, you had to do by hand on your computer remote login to the security on the other computer, and then you could transfer your file, and then you could execute it on the file, right? Not have to do any of that? You not even know where. Do you know where your container is right now? It's afternoon. Where's your container? Well, you don't know, and you don't care, because it's a completely secure environment that executes, billions of these things a day all over the world. But the cool thing is that for academics, many of whom don't have the money right now to run on the cloud, going through this process of being on the NRP means that you're all ready to go. And as soon as you get either cloud credits or money, you can run on any of the commercial clouds, you're already there. So in other words, by using Nautilus in the National Research Platform, you are already cloud ready. You're ready to go to the cloud if and when you need to use that as well. But it's even cooler because not only did we use Kubernetes, but then Rook and Ceph, which are software systems that live inside of Kubernetes, manage data. So, imagine you've got a data set and you throw your data out. Well, like it's out there somewhere. Well, isn't it cool that we can just use the same hierarchical structure of Kubernetes to manage your data sets? And so by adopting that into the universities, which think about how many thousand brilliant people at Google it took to develop all this stuff, and we get it for free. We could not have done this in universities. So it really is a huge leverage that we have by using this sort of open source approach. But we can now have petabytes of distributed data, and of course all of this is instrumented, which I won't get into in detail, but everything, all the paths, all the back and forth, the trace route, all that stuff is containerized, and we follow it all the time. It turns out that the speed of light, as a person who spent his early formative years on Einstein's theory of relativity, does have a limit. It's the law. You can't go faster than the speed of light. So what that does is, even though it's really fast, 186,000 miles a second, if you try to have a coherent storage pool, you can't just do it nationally. You've got to break it up into speed of light limited areas, and we do that in the Ceph pools. Ceph, by the way, was developed in UC Santa Cruz and then made open source to define one of the different ways you can define data. But this also allows, under Kubernetes, for you to have your compute be close to where your data is to minimize the transfer of data to the compute. And of course, we also use Jupyter Hub, and I could give a whole nother lecture on how that has revolutionized things, because of course, as a place that Mosaic came from, Jupyter is just a URL on the web, a Jupyter Notebook. It's just that it has software and it can have data and visualizations and all kinds of stuff. And then you just give that URL to somebody else and they push go and it executes. It's magic, like the web is magic, right? And so that's been a huge thing. Of course, we use GitLab as well. Okay, so let's get specific. The majority of the Fionas and the GPUs and CPUs are in the state of California on these different campuses, and it's of course an eye test, but like UC Irvine right down here has 132 CPU cores and 14 GPUs and 0 terabytes. And so each of these bars tells you how many CPUs, GPUs, and storage there are on each of those campuses in their Fionas. But now the neat thing about this is a lot of the campuses put their stuff up because they got a grant to buy some computers, but they would find that they were limited by that if they just had that resource. Whereas if they federated into this larger academic cloud, then when we can guarantee they'll get every cycle that they paid for, but when they comes to the end of the quarter or end of the semester or whatever, and you need, or you've got paper coming due, you can just burst out into this much larger resource and use it automatically. And so, again, this is the quilt map, and these are all the regional optical networks that we build all of this on that interconnect the campuses. And so here is the one I just showed you. Is a little bit stylized way of seeing the same thing of the scenic connected resources. But then these are all on the different campuses across the country: Kansas State, Southwest Oklahoma State, NYSERNet, University of Delaware, Florida, A&M University, the #1 historically black college and university in the country, according to U.S. News. All of those then are interconnected by those networks and then act as a coherent resource. And so either any of them can reach into California or anywhere else. Anybody in California can reach out there. So there's just this, you're in the cloud, which in San Diego, since we have a marine layer that you're often in, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So now I'm just going to try to finish up with a few applications of all of this. After all, I am in the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And the amazing thing is how quickly the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning has been. So we have these national research platform meetings every so often, and just last year, in February, we had one. And for that, we developed this video, which I really urge all of you to watch. I helped direct it, and Berkeley created it, showing all of the components of what makes the NRP, and then these three major applications, NSF's South Pole Neutrino Detector, IceCube, with beautiful video of them lowering the little detectors down in the ice and under the, in Antarctica and all this stuff. Hooking up multiple VR systems like Bob and Donna and Stuart showed us how to do back in the day, but now hooking them up generally, and then the wildfire supercomputing based on all the sensors, seeing the starts of wildfire and stuff like that. So all of that is done in detail with all the, fire captains and the fires going through and everything in this video. It's only 10 minutes. But I'll just show you quickly what is involved. As I said, the Open Science Grid, which is about 100 clusters worldwide that Frank is the executive director of, these use Condor. And of course, Condor was very key in the alliance, and Maron Livni is still very active in all that. But this also has distributed petabyte everywhere. But you can see about 200,000 Intel cores supporting 400 projects. Well, one of them is IceCube, and the other one is LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravity Wave Observatory. And so they do most of their high throughput computing, and so does the Large Hadron Collider, for instance, and things like that, where you just need to get your data out, do some computing, and bring it back, but you're not, tightly connecting. The OSG doesn't have that many GPUs, but what it turns out is the Nautilus just appears to be like just another cluster in the Open Science Grid. So you can be doing something in the Open Science Grid, and you need some GPUs. You just drop into the PRP and use them. And they did, of course. So IceCube was using 560 of our GPUs, peaking at that per day in 2022. And we provided over 1 million GPU hours just to this one NSF observatory in just the last 2 years. So that was sort of the big mega project. And then here is a good example of the cave that Tom DeFanti and his colleagues developed at UCSD, hooked into the wave in Merced, which is a tiled wall, using the Scenic Interconnect. And notice that there are 20 GPUs running that and 70 using that. Well, in 2017, we used the PRP to just interconnect them so you could have the same data set showing up in both places, like going back to what Donna, Bob, and Stuart showed us how to do in Chesapeake Bay days. But then in 2019, they just said, well, most of these, we don't have people in the caves most of the time. We're just going to add those to the community pool. And so people can just come in and grab those. Most of the time, people aren't in the PR systems and use them. A good example of where these resources come from, all interconnected by Scenic. And you have beautiful video of these two systems and how they're interconnected in the PRP video. And then Ilkay Altanes, who's the Chief Data Science Officer at SDSC, has a bunch of NSF grants that she's been PI for, and one of them is Wi-Fi. And this she's one of the national experts in workflow. So what this does is it takes sensors all across California that bring in the real-time meteorological data, along with the big feed from the weather telescope, the weather forecast. All of that feeds in from all across California through Scenic into the workflow. Then we have much of California's the landscape data. Does it have trees? Does it have mesquite? Is it burnable? Is it a parking lot? So we have this detailed digital twin, basically, of California. Then when there's a real fire, we have all these air assets that are seeing where the perimeter is. All this comes in, and that goes into a software system called Farsight that runs on the San Diego supercomputers, and then that goes and turns out the fire map, and then that's put on a URL, and that's made available. And we've had as many as 8 million Californians trying to figure out where the fire is and where it's going. And this is the one thing that really lets them do that. So those were the big three just a year ago. But now a whole other thing has developed called open force field. And now what this is doing is it sort of displaced these others, as you'll see, as the big kahuna using NRP. It's all open software, open data, open science. And what it's doing is developing quantum chemistry data sets, actually computing those data sets, and then those are used by people who are doing drug design and that kind of stuff. So it's a total community effort. And it was used particularly by Folding at Home during the COVID period. And so 50% of that community runs on Nautilus. And I won't go into great detail about this, but basically you have a quantum chemistry archive. They run it into compute, as I say, 50% done on the Pacific Research Platform. And here you can see that this is the number of quantum chemistry computations, workloads that were done. This is units of 1 million jobs. And this is when they started using Nautilus. And these are the millions of jobs, the increase that is possible. So here what you can see is just in 6 months, this is 300 GPUs, 300 GPUs. This red is open force field, and the green is IceCube. And you can see that IceCube used 290 GPUs with almost 200,000 GPU hours, whereas the open force field used more. So this is now the largest one. But then it turns out that this person, John Kodera at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, uses those things to then, along with AI, so he's now, this is a good example of science now beginning to pull AI in to support computation. And he's now, in addition to what is being used for just the open force field, he's using an additional 292 peaks GPUs. So who uses the NRP? And I'm just about done. This is because I'm an astrophysicist, I only know how to understand things if I do a log-log plot, because there's too many orders of magnitude in astrophysics. So this is on the horizontal axis is the number of GPU hours. Each dot is a namespace, a project within the National Research Platform. And I've just gone back and looked at this over the last 6 months. This was for the most recent NRP workshop that we just had. And each dot then is somebody running a project. And notice that this is 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million GPU hours in 6 months. And the same thing with the CPU hours, except it goes up to 10 million. Now this log-log, a straight line on log-log plot, is just what you'd find, and since the Cray at NCSA. I learned how to do this by taking the users on the Cray XMP and then the YMP and the Cray 2 and asking the same question. How many, what did they need of our resource to get their work done? And the answer is 1 million-fold from the smallest to the largest, all being supported either by, in your case, the supercomputer, or in our case, the NRP. But what's amazing is of those dots, there's only 3 of them, the ones I just told you about, that are disciplinary. All the rest of those dots, almost all of them, are machine learning and AI. And at the meeting, and I won't take you through this, but all the little black dots are the individual PIs of those that gave a talk that are all now recorded on the web in case you want to know more about those particular ones, as well as a few in red that were in my talk. So just over the last 6 months, the 15 largest GPU consuming machine learning and AI, and you can go on the web and find a description of each namespace if you want each project, are peaking at over 700 GPUs. And this is just the top 15, right? So I'm just going to leave, this is more for the aficionados of machine learning, what I call statistical machine learning. But when we wrote the JCI proposal to support the computer scientist in doing AI, we actually had this six-fold way of different algorithms, from deep neural nets to sparse signal processing, latent variables, and all this. These are the categories of algorithms that are used in machine learning. And these 6 broad families are what we then look at, and I go through, actually, I personally go through, in this case, 1,000 of the namespaces that have actually used time, and then search for which of them use which algorithms. And the great majority of those are using neural nets, of course, or reinforcement learning as examples. And PyTorch, TensorFlow, and Keras are the preferred open source deep learning networks. But then there are all these others as well. Again, I'll just leave this for you. And of course, a bunch of them on the leading edge are using transformer neural nets, which include the large language models, the chat GPTs that you hear about and probably are working on yourself. But then there's there's also Llama and BERT and natural language processing and so on. But anyway, it's sort of fascinating to me because, as I said, February of last year, we made this video about what the PRP supported. Machine learning and AI wasn't mentioned in that 10-minute video. And here we are a year and a half later. And so just to give you one example, here's one of the very large users, and they're training robots, but then they're training these AIs. It's like this whole community of AIs, and they're doing millions of these, and they're using like several hundred GPUs to do that. And I love this one because places like Meta that are building these virtual worlds, they need to have objects. So you can just go and take photographs like this of three-dimensional objects, and then you use these machine learning, visual machine learning ways to turn it into a fully three-dimensional thing you can just wander around in. This has used 122 GPUs at 200,000 hours. And this is just a few places, the New York Times, Meta, Time, and so forth, talking about these neural radiance fields for view synthesis, which is NeRFs, is what they call them. But here it is, frontier stuff like this, and it's using this big amount of our time on the NRP. So I'll just end with what I think is the most important thing to have come from the NCSA experience and then the Alliance, and that's community. And so that was one of the things I really took to this. And so we started all the way back in 2017 having these in-person, at that time, National Research Platform workshops, and we're now just had the 5th one just this year. And so there's also a global version of this, the Global Research Platform. And so this brings together sometimes several hundred people. But remember where that came from. In the Alliance, we had these get-togethers called after a thing that was developed both in the Native American culture and then in the United States back in the day, Chautauquas, which was to get people together to give demonstrations, to talk about things and so forth. This is the access grid supporting the Boston Chautauqua in 99. This was all built on the National Technology Grid with Access Grid. Does that look familiar visually? Because this now is Zoom, in which we have the community that is in the NRP working together on weekly Zoom calls, and these are all engineers that are doing something, sharing information. And we have a thing called Matrix, which is a community consulting effort. So everybody who gets on the NRP then also becomes a consultant, unpaid. They're paid for by having access to the community resource. And so there are 800 people on Matrix. And you just have a question if you're getting started in all this, and you throw it up on this thing, and whoever sees it and has an answer answers it. And it's the community not only building the system, but then mutually supporting the use of it by the community. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you.
Question. Oh, thank you. Maybe a little nerdy one, but how does the latency on this network as it is today compare to latency in, say, within the campus or within the building situation?
Right. Well, we actually have done experiments using message passing interfaces and are able to do the same thing when we first asked that question, which is when we had the so-called metacomputer that I named, which was multiple supercomputer centers on much slower and longer latency networks. And we wanted to have experiments, and particularly Paul Woodward was one of the pioneers in using applications in fluid dynamics that spread across these. And what we learned was real simple. Yes, there's latency in the network. Once you know what it is, that tells you how much to compute on the local nodes before you reach to grab another data set. So it was what we came to call latency tolerant supercomputing. Same thing today. So if you want to do something that's tightly coupled, meaning you need very short latencies, then you have to just set up your program so that it does more compute per memory fetch, and it'll still get done fine, as long as the compute is fast enough.
So that's similar to some work I've been doing, but I guess the absolute of, what's the ratio, say, in latency between a tighter architecture?
Right. Well, I don't know the numbers right off the top of my head, but I mean that we do have examples of this for doing reservoir modeling, underground reservoir modeling, for instance, that use the NRP for just that.
Okay, thank you.
Quick one? Real quick one. I wanted to get your quick take on, you showed a lot of the big users, big science, but I think you're also involved in or interested in the democratization of AI for people that might not have normal access to. I think you're doing things with the Cal State system. I just wanted to know what your take is on, we're going to have to learn young people are going to have to learn how to work with AI more than we ever did. So what is your take on the opportunity of platforms like the NRP for democratizing access to AI?
I think it's absolutely huge, and I was talking to John Towns and to some of the staff about this earlier. We are at one of those moments like we were when the supercomputer center started or when the web took off, where we can't get to where we need to be from an international competitive point of view, doing business as usual. We have got to have a almost step function uplift in the trained workforce in the United States in AI and ML. And it's got to happen now. It can't happen tomorrow. And so the key thing is to look, well, where does that workforce come from? And like I say, in California, half of it's from the CSUs, but the community colleges play a huge role. And I just had my meeting with the San Diego Community College District. They're working with the Cal State and San Diego State, because California is regionally organized that way. So we're putting a huge amount of effort into trying to particularly use Jupyter. Jupyter lowers the, Jupyter Hub, Jupyter Notebooks lower the cost of getting started and learning how to do stuff. And then as soon as somebody has got a cool way of using a large language model or whatever, then they just give you the URL and so forth. And so it can spread very quickly. This is exactly what happened with the web. So when I remember my oldest son, Joseph, was in Uni High here when this came out. And so he said, wow, I want to, there was like 100 websites in the world or something. I want to get a website. And so I said, well, there's two ways to do it. You can sit down and learn how to program on a blank piece of paper HTML, or you can go to what you think is an interesting website, look at show HTML, copy it, bring it back, put it on your website, make the changes you need to put your things in, and you're up and going. And of course, that's what he did. And that's just what Jupyter lets you do. It just melts all of the startup cost. So Jupyter, like I said, at Cal State San Bernardino, they are using Jupyter as a way to launch onto the NRP. They have 450 users at Cal State San Bernardino. And so I think we just don't have time to do things the old way, old-fashioned way. So we got to look for things that just slice through it and get us going. And I'd love to collaborate with NCSA on things like that, because with the National AI Research Resource, NARC, coming out as a big program, that is the Congress saying to us, okay, academia, get with it. Let's go.
Let's thank Larry again.